True story. A number of years ago, on a normal, average summer day, a man that was a dairy farmer was leaving the barn. He just milked some cows. As he walked out, holding pails of milk in his hand, there was an earthquake. There was a fissure that erupted very close to the barn. And out of that fissure, there jumped what's often referred to as sprites. And a sprite is a kind of, it's like a type of ball lightning. And so when you have tectonic plates that grind against each other, there's a kind of pyrogene effect and also a piezoelectric effect, which basically means that when you have really high, strong pressure with the grinding, walls of rock meshing against each other, there can be a spontaneous, sudden release of a highly electrified gaseous plasma that emerges. There's different kinds of sprites, and there's a few other types of sort of ball lightning types of atmospheric activity. But in this particular case, what he saw looked like a very bright orb. If I remember correctly, it was something like 5 to 10 feet wide, and it just darted out of the fissure of the earthquake. And the ground rumbled. He was startled, a little bit scared. And what he saw was this ball lightning hover. Maybe it was like 40 feet up in the air, and it just was stationary there. Bit freaked out, and he wanted to get out of there. So he either dropped or he put his pails of milk down, and he really just wanted to get away from this thing. So he looked around him, just kind of frozen in place, looking for an escape route. And what he noticed was that when he moved his eyes back and forth, the orb, the plasma lightning ball, changed position in the sky to follow his gaze. So that was pretty nerve-wracking. And then he found that when he took a few, steps in one direction, again, the orb would change position in regards to his, direction. Why am I telling you this? This is probably going to be one of the stranger videos for the Paranormal Studies group that we've had so far, and it's also, honestly, one of the most important ones. I've got a few stories to share with you that are very pertinent. There's been a kind of a media explosion, I've noticed, especially over the last few years, about the shadow self, or the dark side of the self. And, you see kind of a popularized, sort of course work, healing work being put on about, how do you heal the shadow self? How do you deal with the dark side? And I've reviewed a lot of different materials from different sources. My personal opinion is that most of this stuff is complete bullshit, and it's a monumental waste of time, not to mention, effort and often cash. Just going through YouTube, it's astounding how many people are self-proclaimed, whether they're life coaches or whatever, and they're offering, often for a hefty fee, to help a person, do shadow work. And a lot of this is just kind of regurgitated, popular, memes. Somebody has done a modicum of legwork investigating a few disparate sources, and they've tacked together a lot of word salad around a couple of ideas that may have a small amount of validity. I think one of the problems is that this topic isn't well understood, and even for people that, kind of behave like scavengers and go through the works of folks like Carl Jung, trying to understand, what is the shadow, what are archetypes. Nobody's really doing the serious, effort. And, the reality is that even if a person puts in serious effort, it's challenging to really understand and find out what this is all about. There's a lot of erroneous concepts floating about. One is, embracing the shadow side, embracing the dark side, or incorporating the dark self. And part of that error comes from not properly understanding what's being dealt with. And so we're going to take a look at what is that all about? How does it break down? What's the correct way of handling this issue? And before we can even do that, before we can even get, into understanding what the shadow self is, we need to understand why would we want to do that in the first place. And we also need to understand or have a much clearer idea of energy dynamics. And when I say energy dynamics, I mean things about the way the psyche works, individual and also group consciousness. A lot of these really critical areas have been, they've been obscured, basically. Maybe part of that's by design, but I think a lot of it is just because of ignorance. So I'm going to present you first with a number of ideas, principles, and understandings of energy dynamics. And then we're going to take a look at dealing with the shadow self and related issues. But understand that anyone that wants to get a handle on working practically with paranormal realms, it's super important to get a handle on, what the dark self is. Like, what is the shadow that resides inside of us? What is good and evil? Are good and evil real? Are they just, fabrications? One thing that I've noticed a lot is that in different circles, especially New Age circles, a favorite game is to label good and evil as non-existent. A lot of people play with the duality paradigm, saying that, everything is oneness. There really is no good or evil. And that's absolutely wrong. That's like grotesquely wrong. And it's a dangerous notion. It's not very difficult for a person that pays attention when they're observing nature and natural phenomena. The bulk of phenomena is binary. Even stars. Most of the stars that you see in the sky, even when you take a look at a single point of light, you're not looking at a single star. You're looking at a binary system. So most stars have a twin that circulate around them. Most of the processes, that occur in nature are polarized. There's a big difference between the idea of oneness and unity. They're not quite the same thing. And a lot of the popular notions of what's labeled as oneness is pretty much a fabrication. Unity is a different scenario. Unity is a real thing, but when you have a unified state, that unified state has the capacity to express itself in a spectral fashion. The same way that if you look at a rainbow is a multiplicity of colors. But the rainbow with all the colors together is a unified state. So we're going to take a look at some things related to the mechanics of what we're going to be discussing. My teacher years ago had cautioned me about what he called the psychic monster. And my understanding is that most of the people that exist or have ever existed have a domain inside their minds and inside their hearts that are not them. There's an actual personality that resides inside that is not native, natural to the individual, and yet it's entwined with them. Usually at birth, it has a very real substance. It has a very real constitution. What's interesting is that most people's shadow self, and when we say this, I want you to just basically literally imagine that there is a kind of a doppelganger, a kind of an identity that resides within you. And it, for all apparent purposes, it seems to be a part of you. And there are hundreds of different types of dark selves. one of the things that they almost never teach in any kind of contemporary shadow work is actually truly identifying the specific characteristics of the person's individual dark self, because they don't have the understanding, they don't have the knowledge, they're ignorant of that terrain. And, you know, there's an Aboriginal native saying, you know, about you've got like a white dog and a black dog that live inside of you. And then the question arises, you know, which dog wins? Is it the dog of light or is it the dog of dark? And their answer is, well, it's the dog you feed the most. But when you take a look at some of the contemporary esoteric schools, they use the malarkey of, well, just embrace your shadow self. You know, just heal the wound and, you know, incorporate and integrate that within you. You know, go dance, you know, with the dark, sinister wolves at night, and, you know, let them. This is ridiculous. The mentor that I had told me he had different labels for it. One of the labels he used was was Moloch, you know, and he didn't mean the Moloch from historic demonology, but what he meant was a depraved form of the self that attempts to usurp the true identity. And this false self is the one that usually experiences the opposite of self-actualization. And a lot of times, most people will spend inordinate amounts of time stuck in a gray sort of Bardo reality where that false self is the one that's in control. It's the one that does the thinking, the feeling, the directing. A person can blank out for years their perception of reality, what they think, you know, from that mindset is right or wrong or correct or false. You know, it's the false self that chooses bad friends, chooses, you know, the wrong partner, chooses the wrong light path, you know, like career path. And so my teacher had told me that the only way to deal with this particular dark self is to kill it. You know, you don't embrace it, you don't feed it, you don't try to, you know, get happy with it. You erase and remove it as much as you can, and so you basically don't show it any mercy. And in order to manage or deal with the dark self, you have to know what it is. You have to understand how it operates, and you need to have this understanding specifically, because, like I said, there's hundreds of different types, and so it's very difficult to actually get a specific profile of what it is and where it hides. And now the other thing that's interesting is that for most people, the dark self doesn't just have a specific profile, which can be discovered through a very meticulous process, but this dark self also will reside predominantly in a particular area of life. And this, again, will be different for different people. For some people, the dark self will live in the domain of the psyche that has to do with things like, you know, their work or their career, or it could also reside, you know, in their physicality, so in the state of their health. You know, it could reside in, you know, how they relate to other people. They could reside in their romantic or love life. And it's not always active for most people. It will come out of dormancy, you know, in different kinds of situations, and it will have a cyclic nature. Now, one of the things that's difficult to grasp here is that there is a core nugget of evil that will reside in most people. This is what we're addressing. Now, this is different, although there can be relations and interactions between other kinds of dysfunction. So we can describe and define aberrant or dysfunctional behavior, even dysfunctional personas that may be resident within a person. And in these particular cases, other kinds of approaches may work. So it would be accurate to say that, you know, if a person needed therapy to overcome some kind of an issue, and we were not dealing with the core nugget of evil, but we were dealing with other kinds of, you know, misbehavior or emotional imbalance, mental imbalances, that, you know, this is a completely different situation. although that core nugget of evil will often try to influence it. So before we can get to that most important part, we need to cover some mechanics very quickly. So I'm going to step you through some items. And I'm going to assign some homework to you folks. So individual consciousness and collective consciousness are different, different birds, and they very much relate, to each other. And I want you to have an understanding of what some of these mechanics are. So the first thing we're going to take a look at, and there will be a link in the comments section. Many years ago, I had the good fortune of having dialogue with the most interesting researcher named Michael Donovan. And Donovan was a sailor, a professional sailor, and also a professional steganographer. And what that meant was he was involved with the study and application of a special kind of code and encryption that was often used in different intelligence operations. And so the idea basically was that he was active in different ways. What would happen is if a message wanted to be communicated to a party in a certain geographic region, as an example, a magazine article would be placed in a pop magazine in the region, and it would be just a message, perhaps in the classifieds, and it would seem like nonsense, but to the person that was reading it, they would understand that it was a code to take a certain action or not take a certain action. The thing that was interesting about Donovan is he also spent time with some curious figures in American history that were involved with, a strange kind of math. He called it the new geometry. For a time, much of Donovan's work could be reviewed for free online, but unfortunately, I don't know if something's happened to him, but certainly much of his content has gone missing on the net. In the comments section, there will be a link you can access. Most of the pivotal work that he was involved with. I don't agree with everything that Donovan said, but an exploration of his work is very helpful and important for our students here, because it begins to shed light on how some of these mechanics work. So one of the things that Donovan came up with was he arranged what he referred to as the zodiac symbols on Buckminster's vector equilibrium. So the vector equilibrium is essentially 13 balls, single ball at the center. And what he claimed was that the zodiac signs themselves were simply archetypal tokens representing certain kinds of energy. And the placement on the vector equilibrium was very specific. There would be a dynamic interchange of energy. In geometry, when we do sphere packing, we have this thing called the kissing point. The kissing point is basically where the spheres meet. You can kind of see that there's like a little interesting sort of star-like symbol in the center there. But what Donovan claimed was that each of these spheres was a highly charged domain of energy that affected us on a psychophysical level, and that energy was continually bouncing around within these different spheres, and would also go into the center. So, for instance, energy is associated with the libido, Scorpio, would be polarized by Taurus, and it could go through the center. I'm not going to get into all the dynamics of this because there's a lot of information. I'm going to try and cover a lot of topics quickly because really you're looking at some time and effort on your part to get up to speed with this. And this isn't the only geometric form that he came up with, so I would strongly suggest that you avail yourself of that content and become familiar with how he talks about the operations. Now understand that my approach is scientific. I'm not a traditional astrologer. I don't prefer using simply a metaphysical or metaphoric approach. I need something that's hard, tangible, quantifiable, testable, repeatable. And yet there are ideas that you'll find in this work that will be monumentally helpful. All right, so moving on to the next topic. Now, a number of years ago, there was an experiment done, and it had to do with a project called the Global Consciousness Study. And again, there's a lot of details here. You can find out more about this in the link. The basic idea was a number of scientists had observed a curious effect happening globally when there was some kind of major trauma occurring. And it was a retired Princeton scientist, Dr. Roger Nelson, that was heavily involved with this. I'm just going to give you the basic idea. And there was some critique of this project, but there was also some astounding data. And while the critique leveled at this particular project has some validity, when we take a look at the context of this project in light with other discoveries, which I'm not going to cover here, but I will at a future time, you begin to see how valid this is. So here's the basic idea. You have a simple printed circuit board. That printed circuit board is connected to a radioactive isotope. The radioactive isotope has a standard decay rate. Understand that isotopes, when they're emitting particles, they do so at a fairly constant decay rate. So there's very little variability in it. And the change in that decay rate occurs very slowly over time. So that means that the energy coming off a decaying radioactive isotope is stable. It should always be stable. So what they did, I'm giving a very brief synopsis of this. So what they did is they put the radioactive isotope onto the printed circuit board. They arranged it so that when the particles would emit from the decay, they would hit a sensor plate. And that sensor plate would register the emission as a binary on or off. So a positive, essentially, or a negative charge. And this would be akin to flipping a coin 50 to 100 times. If you take a quarter, or a penny or a dime, any kind of coin, and you flip it 50 to 100 times, probability rate should be that it lands on heads half the time and tails half the time. And this is what's expected with this particular device, which they called an egg. Now, what they noticed was that as this device ran 24 hours a day, and they would look at the data, it would always have the same kind of flow rate. In other words, it was, half the time it was, positive, half the time it was negative. And this was based on what they knew about the standard decay radiation emission. But what they noticed was that whenever there was a global trauma, like a global event that was shocking, and some of the first cases that they observed was the 9/11 and also the death of Diana, there was a sudden surge. There was a change in the decay rate. This project grew so that they had somewhere in excess of 70 to 80 installations across the planet at different institutions, different universities, branching out from Princeton University. And they began to monitor global events. And what they found was that also things like volcanoes, earthquakes, but especially anything that produced a massive, emotional, intense experience across the planet would cause a sudden surge or skew in the data that was printed out. The implication being that there was an intrinsic connection between what was happening in global collective consciousness and the physical decay rate of a radioactive isotope. So that's the next story that I wanted to present to you, and then we're going to take a look also at one of the articles that had come across my desk from the alternate science and energy technology group that I was involved with years ago was KeelyNet. And the article was related to an experiment where a glass vial full of a liquid medium that was sealed, held horizontally in the fluid there was a bacterial colony. And what they did is they would exert a powerful magnetic field that was either of a north polarity or a south polarity at one end of the tube and then at the other. So they'd flip the magnetic field type. And what they found was that the bacteria's behavior would change in regards to the type of magnetic field it was exposed to. So, and there's a bunch of other experiments related to this where they found that a biological reaction to a magnetic field would vary between contraction and expansion. In the case of the test tube, what would happen is the bacteria would either swim away from the magnetic field or it would swim towards the magnetic field. We see a correlation of this. Cattle and wild animals will often, when they're grazing in the field, will unconsciously align their bodies in such a way where they're lining up to the global magnetic field, literally. Like they will be physically directed, like this, their spines will be following the magnetic field path. And so what that means is that we see an influence of the background magnetic field on the organism's behavior. But what I wanted to say is that, in this case, we have a single horizontal axis. But understand that there are a number of forces that exist in nature that go beyond what we've been told exist. I'll go more into that in detail at a later time. But coming back to this object, imagine that each of these spheres represents a unique force of potency. And imagine that in the center, there's a sphere in the center. Imagine that sphere in the center is an organism, and that these energy spheres around it represent different kinds of kinematics or different kinds of impulse. So when we consider the bacteria, the bacteria was in a horizontal tube, and so it only had a single axis like that. So it would go back and forth depending on what the magnetic field was. But understand that if there's a multiplicity of forces that are surrounding the psyche, we have field charges that are going through all these different domains, and they can also cause geometric dynamics between domains. So that organism that's in the center is under a constant influence of a multipolar set of dynamic charges. And the strength and amplitude and quality of these charges on the surface of the inner sphere will be undergoing constant change. So what that means is you might have, say, this sphere on a certain day, it's highly charged, and it's bursting out. And then other spheres may be quite weak. And so in the sphere in the center, you'll have this rapidly changing dynamic geometry, the colors and flavors, the quality of the experience that the organism is having within that moment in time space. Okay. So, now another thing I wanted to talk to you about was there's a fellow named Dr. Joe Champion, who I had the good fortune of working on a project in the past called the Aphysical Dimensional Access Manager. He called it ATOM for short. Joe Champion was a favorite on the KeelyNet board. He made a number of outstanding discoveries. He was heavily persecuted, heavily critiqued. He was called out by some as a hoaxer, as a scammer. He got in trouble with the law. My experience with him personally and other people that knew him well knew that he was really onto something and that he was being harassed. And you'll find pro and con arguments, of this fellow online. But I know from firsthand experience, when I worked as a volunteer on one of his projects, how well one of his technologies worked, because I experienced it. The Atom was a device that had a protoplasmic medium where there was a bacterial culture inside of a chamber. and I won't go into all the particulars here, but the chamber had a number of electrodes, like platinum-style electrodes that went into it, and he was feeding signals into this culture and then outputting their feedback. And I won't go into all the, there's just not going to be enough time to go into all the details, but the goal was of an anti-aging type process. And what was happening was he had a feedback loop where the bacteria was literally remembering what its physical state was in a previous instance. And what we saw was an unusual state happening with the bacteria in the culture. And then the electrical output will be converted into phonemes. And when you were exposed to this, it had a very curious sound and sensation. And myself and a number of other people witnessed physiological effects where it appeared to be a form of age regression. And he was also working with autistic and Asperger's type children. He had developed a means to cause state change in people that had Asperger's. I had a friend, a close personal friend, who underwent some treatment with that for a different kind of condition and also noticed a direct effect. But the reason that I bring him up is that he had developed a unique software application that was able to plot synodic regions of the lunar or moon travel path, 57 points of critical activity over the period of a number of months. But the way he had it set up was, in this software, you could find to the minute, to an hour block, days in advance, when the individual and collective behavior would go bananas. It would just be insane. And he had provided me, this software was never distributed to the public. It was given to a small handful of people. And I was given a copy. I'm probably one of the few people on the planet that still has a copy of it. And I've field tested it for years, and it's absolutely astounding. And what it does is it shows you like a grid of exact times of when the moon is having a marked gravitational effect on the planet, and so there's gradations of it. What I would often do is go on field tests, and I would, I would observe changes in group behavior during high alert times. Did that for years, and so one of the things that can happen is that when certain times hit, in the collective unconscious, in most individuals, that dark shadow side comes out. You can observe it real time. You can witness it happening. You can certainly sense the the impulse and the state change within oneself. I lost track of how many times I saw horrible accidents occur within those time regions. So I'm going to, I'll go over more of that also in the future. But we can use the position of the moon to get a determination as to when the shadow self is most likely active. And I've got one more case I want to tell you about. In the 1950s, 1952, J.H. Nelson noticed a planetary positional effect on shortwave quality, like signal quality. And this was mainstream science, and it was, I believe it was RCA. One of the problems that they had, and I'm just going to give a brief synopsis of this. What happened was that there was a number of communication-style cables and systems that were heavy hardware, and they would periodically black out over the course of a year. So they would just lose power. And they couldn't figure out what was causing it. So they brought this engineer in, and he studied the problem for a year. He couldn't figure it out. He finally discovered that when fast, close orbiting bodies were at certain angles to each other, they set up a radiative shear wavefront that impacted the planet's atmosphere, and the intensity of that wavefront was what was causing the power blackouts. And so Nelson derived a special kind of shielding that the company put in place, and the power blackouts stopped. Now, understand that I use certain kinds of astrological ideas or notions in the work and research that I do, but I don't take a traditional astrological approach. What I'm looking for is, what is the effect of stellar influences actually on organisms, including their psyche? How does this affect behavior? We already know, for example, that the cerebral spinal fluid in the spine will change in pressure density and in circulation rate. So the actual rapidity of the flow of cerebral spinal fluid will change in relation to lunar position. So, and certainly if you alter the speed and pressure density of fluid in the spine, you have an enormous possibility of seeing changes in mood, behavior, perception, this sort of thing. So if Nelson saw, planets like Mars and Mercury at hard angles to each other, setting up shear wave fronts from space, impacting the planet, capable of knocking out physical hardware, imagine the effect that would have on much more sensitive and vulnerable, biological organisms. Understand that, we as people are basically walking bags of water with a little bit of mineral salts thrown in. So we're going to be much more sensitive than physical hardware, like, cables that are buried under the ground. Now, tying this together, the reason that I'm telling you all this is that paranormal activity often is related to what's going on in collective consciousness. It has a periodicity. There are cycles associated with it. There are also, at the beginning of this video, I mentioned that dairy farmer where he saw ball lightning coming out of a fissure, from the earthquake. So paranormal activity, by way of analogy, is correspondent to this type of effect, because paranormal activity often, not always, but often can and does exhibit and express itself when there is collective pressure being exerted in a cyclic nature. So what that means is, and as an example, it's very easy to find. There are archives that you can search for free online, and what you will see historically is that in many cases, when there is a UFO sighting, in a certain geographic region, what you'll see happening is that there isn't just a single UFO sighting happening at that time. There are clusters of sightings happening in many places within the same time range. And on top of that, you'll see that the qualitative description, in other words, people that are witnessing a certain kind of UFO incident, will say quite clearly, what the characteristics of what they felt the craft looked like, possibly what the occupants, look like. So you have the very similar kind of phenomena occurring at the same time and in certain very specific different places on the planet. This you'll find that this same kind of event will be congruent with other kinds of paranormal activity. So this could be like hauntings. This could be, I'm still out on what I think the Mandela effect is, but I think there is something to that. But this process will apply to a variety of other kinds of, the appearance of cryptids, the appearance of, unknown creatures. These will often happen within similar time frames. And so as we become aware of the mechanics and dynamics of this, we are able to improve our investigations, become more accurate at forecasting when they will occur and how to manage them. Next day. And one last example that I want to talk about. This next item is quite important, and I want to impress upon everyone that everything that we're discussing in this video is connected in a number of ways. And so it's really super important to grasp the fundamentals and ideas behind each of the items I'm presenting to you. This next one is comprised of two parts. One is called capillary dynamolysis, and then the other one is chromatograms. Now, in the course of my journey, I've gotten a lot of my information from different sources, including contemporary mainstream science, alternative science, independent research groups, different organizations, very learned individuals, and also, like I've mentioned before, sort of like the dustbins of history. Just because I investigate something doesn't necessarily mean that I buy into all of the ideologies that sometimes get associated with the groups that are engaged in discovery. What I try to do is I try to, review material and see how worthwhile it is as a standalone concept, irrespective of the associations that groups may attach to it. This is the same thing like, the ancient Chinese discovered gunpowder, and they discovered a process that worked independent of the cultural and mythic associations that they may have had of it. So, when gunpowder was discovered, they may have had different kinds of mythological attributes, like, oh well, gunpowder is a gift from the gods, and it's it's the breath of dragons, whatever, this kind of thing. So, an area that I found to be especially meaningful is some of the scientific / esoteric schools, one of which is the Rudolf Steiner school. I don't buy into anthroposophy, or I can never say that word right, anthroposophy. I'm not into theosophy. Not saying there aren't any good ideas there. It's just not my personal philosophical bent. Having said that, there was certainly some really stunning breakthroughs scientifically that really apply directly to our investigation of the paranormal and also other aspects of our lives. So there's three areas that we're going to delve into in this series. So one is the application of analyzing the nature of gravity, and we'll do this through an investigation of, as I mentioned, chromatograms and capillary dynamolysis. Another area is projective geometry. This was championed by a fellow named George Adams, and this was part of the Steiner school. And then there's some other areas that are related, and this has to do with how certain forces affect organic growth, and also the cultivation and maintenance of vital life. But that latter domain we're going to explore along with projective geometry in a later episode. So here's the deal. I had promised and mentioned in earlier videos that one of my intentions was to equip you folks with a variety of tools that would strongly empower your own investigations. And I had mentioned things like frame dragging, understanding the nature of the moment, this sort of thing. So around the 1920s, a few people in the Steiner school were investigating what they were coining as etheric forces. One of the things that can happen when you have a group investigating phenomena is that if they're exposed to something new that's outside their frame of reference, they'll attempt to come up with labels to describe that phenomena. Sometimes those labels are more appropriate than others. So when they used the term etheric forces, they were using that term because they didn't understand certain properties and characteristics of the phenomena they were investigating. What was actually going on was they were witnessing variance in the local ambient gravitational field, as well as a mixing and a changing of amplitude in the background local magnetic field, often expressed in units of milligauss. So the reason that this is important is that paranormal activity will tend to peak and trough at certain times in direct proportion to both gravitational and magnetic field variance. So too will one's individual state vary probabilistically, as well as we'll see variance in the collective continuum of consciousness. So in other words, the average person that's on the planet. And one of the things I wanted to see folks equipped with when I mentioned about the tools is I want you to have a way to be able to detect the current state of the gravitational and magnetic field force effects, and to have, the ability to also forecast this over time, because this gives you a greater chance of capturing and determining how potent a paranormal influence may be. It also gives a chance to get a window on one's own potential vulnerability at a certain point in time space, and also the vulnerability of those we might be associated with. So I'm going to describe the some of the mechanics and principles of the Steiner school's approach with capillary dynamolysis and chromatograms. For those of you that are familiar with Emoto Masaru, the Japanese scientist, this fellow had discovered that there could be an association between specific water crystal formation to emotional states. And I'm not going to go into a lot of it in this particular episode. Some of these things that we're bringing up now I'll cover in greater detail again at a later time. But also, all of the information that we're covering here, you'll have much more detailed content available in the link in the comments section below. So you have a lot of homework to do, and it's important that you put in the time and effort to review these materials to really get a grasp. My purpose here is to introduce you to these concepts, give you enough to go on, point you in the right direction, and then you need to put in the legwork. So I'm just going to read something here. Chromatography is testing for quality and vitality. When Steiner noted the icy crystals that form in winter on the panes of windows are different in a flower shop from those appearing on the windows of a butcher shop, he suggested to Pfeiffer and to another of his earlier followers, Lily Kalisko, that they experiment in the lab with the formation of crystals as a means of demonstrating what he called his formative forces in nature. Chromatography, image of a BD carrot to satisfy Steiner's desire to demonstrate what lies beyond the veil of matter. Pfeiffer developed a system known as chromatography, in which various solutions of mineral salts imbibed by rounds of paper were made to reveal the differing patterns left by forces at work in soil and plant life. Now, basically what we've got is this. Before I jump into the principles of capillary dynamolysis and chromatography, I want to address something that many of you have come across before in regards to synchronicity. A lot of people talk about seeing these repeat number sequences. Like when you look at the clock, it's 11:11 or it's 3:33. Or you see these numbers in sequence appearing over and over again. There's a very poor understanding as to what causes this, and I'm not going to address all of the important, meaningful elements of that phenomena here. I'll address this in a greater degree in later videos, but the true reason that this phenomena exists Most of the stuff that you see on YouTube that addresses this is poorly educated guesses and fictional word salad, so you can ignore almost everything else you've come across. So the real deal I'm going to be presenting in part here, and then I'll follow up, like I said, in another video. But this is a phenomena of resonance. It's a phenomena specifically of sympathetic resonance. So in the course of my research over a long period of time, an area of interest was examining something called tables of correspondences. Tables of correspondences are an artifact that's been around for a very long time, centuries, if not millennia, both in Eastern and Western schools. And I've spent a lot of time reviewing many tables for many individuals and schools. Certainly you'll see things like astrological tables where they'll say that, a certain planet is related to or can be related to a certain herb, or a tree or a spice or an animal. There's some degree of truth in this, but I have to say that in excess of 80 to 85% of most of the tables of correspondences that I've ever seen produced from anywhere were full of all kinds of error. So it was a very difficult process to narrow this down. I spent time, for instance, in some of the best libraries, certainly in Canada. There is a library of antiquities at the University of Victoria on Vancouver Island in British Columbia, and probably one of the better schools of its type, or one of the better antiquities libraries of its type for the subject that I was investigating. But basically, when we can narrow down an accurate table of correspondences and we see relationships between different kinds of objects, invariably what's happening is that there is a very distinctive, very tangible, very substantial real natural world correspondence going on between the two. And I'm going to give you an example. So many people claim that there is a relationship between the moon and the metal silver, but very few people were ever able to describe why is that. Some people that didn't do enough legwork would say, oh, well, it's because, the moon is kind of a whitish silver, and silver is, similar in color to the moon. That's nowhere near good enough to establish any kind of, testable, causative factor. However, the radius of the moon is about 10,800 kilometers. And the weight of silver is 1.7 approximately angstroms. So what that means is we actually have a numeric value that exists that's directly associated with both of these. So we have, that radius was off. I meant to say the moon radius is 1,737 kilometers, and the atomic weight, or mass rather, is 107.8682 angstroms. So what we see here is a decimal 10 relationship. So that means that there is actually a sympathetic resonance between the metal silver and the moon. And I've got some other information that will be accessible on this link that you can review. But coming back to capillary dynamolysis and the chromatography, the basic premise is this. Steiner and his school thought that objects that had a solid density to their matter had their first influence native to our planet. But the moment that matter undergoes state change, so it goes through a state change from matter to liquid, to gas, and of course, there's other states of matter like plasma, that other forces, come into play. And Steiner thought that when matter was in a liquid state, that it was more prone to what he called etheric influence. And when we say etheric, we should really be substituting the term gravitational. And what's interesting is that, with Emoto Masaru's work, which was contemporary, understand that his process was taking a pan, and that pan, like a flat pan, was filled with water in a liquid state, and that pan was slapped in close proximity to an individual or to a group of individuals in which there was induced, a variety of emotions, positive and negative. So, in the positive states, we would see, after that exposure happened, he would take the pan, place it into a flash freeze kiln, and you'd have a very rapid crystallization of the thin layer of water. And then you would take it out of the flash freeze kiln, and you would examine the surface of the frozen water, the ice, and examine, the crystalline structure. And so what he found, overwhelmingly, was that when the water in its liquid state was exposed to positive intense emotions, we had a high degree of symmetry. Now, this is important because this is going to tie into other things we talk about. Understand that good and evil are absolutes. They exist irrespective of human presence. This is part of natural law. And we can, to a degree, substitute the terms good and evil for symmetry and asymmetry, harmony or disharmony. We're going to get into that a little bit more at a later time. So the way that capillary dynamolysis works, the way that it works is that you have two different setups producing two different kinds of results. So one is a circular filter, or it can be some other kind of filter, and it's a membrane, usually of a fine kind of fiber or paper. We then have a liquid, and in the liquid there is dispersed metallic mineral salts. Sometimes it's a singular mineral salt, but in many cases it can be a number of them. And these are metallic, so silver, gold, different kinds of nitrates, that kind of thing. So what we have here is a process where we soak the membrane with this liquid full of metallic mineral salts, and then we allow it to dry. Now, there's more to this process, and for those of you that want to try this, the instructions and details and parameters will be included in that link, access to more information. But the idea is that the quality of the moment can be captured and displayed as an image. So, and again, remember when I said that we instead of use the word etheric forces, we use gravitational. So what that allows us to do is to see, the visual characteristics of the true quality of the moment in time-space of the gravitational forces. This is important because you will find that in most cases, paranormal activity is a manifestation of different kinds of pressures, which include stellar forces. When certain things are happening in the sky, you can almost count that at critical, often predictable geographic regions, some kind of paranormal phenomena is going to manifest. Also at critical times, the dark side, the shadow self, will tend to emerge. Now, if the conditions are harmonious and there's a lot of symmetry, and there's this saying by Corelli, when the atmosphere is clear. So if it's a beautiful atmosphere, the probability of negative paranormal influences manifesting is extremely remote. One of the reasons for this is that most, to my understanding, negative paranormal entities and forces highly prefer not to manifest during times where they encounter a lot of resistance, because negative paranormal influences, while they are not bounded to time, space, the way that human life is, they can't completely escape time, not completely, and they also cannot completely escape gravity. So they have to deal with it, in different ways at different times. Now, that's not to say that when the atmosphere is clear and there's a high degree of symmetry, that you won't have paranormal influences manifesting. But the probability then is that it would be positive paranormal influences that would occur during those times. So when we use capillary dynamolysis or chromatography, what we're doing is we're looking for patterns, because this is the interesting thing. This is what you'll find. And keep in mind that this is a low-cost method. This is a low-cost tool set. Anybody can do this. You just take some time and effort, a little bit of study. So if you use the same liquid mix, so you have the same proportions of mineral salts, you have the same liquid medium, you're using the same membrane or filter type, what you'll find is that when the gravitational forces change, different patterns will correspond to that. So that gives us an ability and a means to identify unseen characteristics of the quality of the time and the space. We can directly see a kind of imprint of the gravitational profile. Now, Kalisko, a colleague of Rudolf Steiner's, did an amazing amount of work and cataloged all kinds of state changes. And one of the areas, or two of the areas that she specialized in, was graphing or capturing with capillary dynamolysis the influence of eclipses. And eclipses were very interesting because in many cases when an eclipse occurred, the pattern formation was opaque. In other words, you could see that when the eclipse was active, that the nature of the pattern formation was very amorphous. So there really wasn't much to discern there. But when you have heavy moving stellar bodies, like Saturn, Jupiter, etc., you'll see very distinctive common shapes occurring during the drying process of the liquid applied to the membrane over time. Now, one thing that's known is that when we're dealing with the shadow self, or we're dealing with negative, hostile paranormal influences, many times this will clock to aspects that form in the sky, for example, between Neptune, Mars, Pluto, Uranus. These are usually hard angles. And so if you have, for instance, Mars at a 90-degree angle to Neptune, this is often considered a kind of demonic gateway. At least it biases or tends towards that. And when Mars squares Neptune, there will be certain points that become active across the globe. Some will be, more potent than others, and these can also be mapped. We'll get into the process of that in a later episode. But the idea behind the application of these two tools is to allow an individual to become familiar with what the visual characteristics of the gravitational force field is at a certain point in time. And when you pay attention, when you start to catalog this, you'll become familiar with literally the shape of the time-space. And you'll be able to identify the shape of the time-space to likely manifestations, both in yourself as well as into the paranormal arena. Now, with chromatography, this is similar but a bit of a different horse. So when we look at capillary dynamolysis, in most cases what we have is a square image with a number of shapes and lines and different demarcations, clusters that will appear in the drawing process. And with chromatography, what we have is a radial circular image display. It often looks like something like a sunflower, but the patterns will often change. And what's very interesting is Steiner was also involved in an area called biodynamics. Biodynamics was and is a way of vitalizing farm yield and the growing of crops. So these particular tools are often used to get a window on the state of vitality of a certain crop. We're not going to go into that here. But what I want to impress upon you is that these are tools that you can use to detect the quality and nature of the active gravitational force field. I'm going to cover other kinds of gravity detectors that will be super handy. There are electronic gravity detectors that can be purchased and or built. It's not terribly difficult to build. A lot of people, even in the paranormal community, aren't up to speed on these things. I guess I just never really made it out to the general public much, but we're going to cover some of those again in a later episode. Those ones are particularly helpful because when we're using the Steiner approach, there is some time to allow the membrane to dry. So if you need data within, say, a day or a number of hours, it can be helpful. But if you want to do active real-time monitoring, there's a way to do that, but we'll cover that in another episode. So something that's super important that I want to impress upon you, I can't remember if I mentioned this before, but that one mentor of mine told me, he said, if all he could do would be to accurately identify and forecast with a certain degree of certainty when the evil times were, he would have made a small fortune for himself. And the reality is that he wasn't too bad at doing that to begin with. And there's some stories I'll tell you at some point. But getting that ability of accuracy is actually possible. And we're going to talk more about that in detail. But the reason that I'm combining the shadow self work with paranormal style investigation is that for you, the investigator, you need to have a really solid understanding of who your shadow self is, specifically the characteristic traits. And one of the reasons for that is that if you ever get involved or engaged in some serious investigation and you uncover something that has merit and you make progress, and maybe you're actually involved with facilitating a greater good occurring, something evil is not going to like that. And a lot of times negative or hostile paranormal influences will try to lash back, and they don't play fair, and they're not bound to normal human tactics, strategy, or logic, and they like to hit from strange angles, and especially they like to attack from areas that you would least expect. Because they're not typically bound to time space the way that we are, you might go on a paranormal investigation, you might have a victory, and you might not experience any immediate lashback. But that's not to say lashback isn't going to come, because sometimes these things will be able to plan lashback days, weeks, months, years in advance, and they'll just wait. They'll just wait for the right moment. So what you need to do is you need to be equipped with enough understanding to anticipate how, where, when, why, they'll launch an offensive. And if you get a good handle on that, if you can manage it, generally you should do pretty well. So we want to understand what are the hidden crevices in the psyche, what is the shadow self of the individual, because that's the area that they'll use to get a foothold. That's their trapdoor into the rest of your life. A lot of times when things go bad in a person's life, a lot of times when there's heartbreak or failure or defeat, loss, mistakes made, it's often coming through that secret trapdoor in the psyche. And so if you've pissed something off, you can absolutely count that what they're going to try and do is they're going to try and mess with and tinker with a dark spot in your psyche, and then they'll try to wreak havoc in the rest of your life through that as a conduit. So there's a couple of things I want to get you up to speed on here. One is availing yourself of certain resources. Something that is a pretty important understanding and tool to get up to speed with as quickly as possible is how gravitational changes in the moon can affect you. There will be a latency or dormancy, as well as sort of an active region occurring with the shadow self in relation to lunar position. And there are different resources out there, but there is a book that I came across some time ago. It's not easy to find. It might be hard to track down. It's quite old, and it's funny because I've often found that when we're dealing with... one thing I should mention about capillary dynamolysis and chromatography is this isn't woo. This isn't simply esoterica. The Steiner school, it was a mixed bag. You had some people that were doing really, robust, standalone science that was, given addressment and credit in mainstream, and some of it was metaphysical woo. But there's actually contemporary literature that does like almost like a neural network, full analysis of chromatography and capillary dynamolysis, and verifies its authenticity as a viable tool for measuring different forces. But I want you to get this book. It's called Moon Power, and it doesn't look like much. It's a bit of a cheesy cover. The author is Mort Gale, and the title reads, "Discover how to use a force more vital to your unconscious drives than sun signs." And there's a chapter in here, chapter 5. It's just called "The Moon and Bad Times." I don't know if you can see that. Now, the deal with this book is it talks about lunar noon and lunar midnight. And what happens is as the moon cycles the planet over 24 hours, the angle of the gravitational influence changes. And so this will affect the mind and the brain and physiology. And you can count that on a regular basis, as you begin to chart this over time, that your shadow self will strive to take the stage at critical points. Now, the cool thing about this book is it teaches you how to simply chart when the most critical times are. There's a lot of other benefits to this book, because not only can you get a very strong handle on plotting critical times for yourself, but it'll also give you a window also into a greater probability of paranormal activity. Now, there's a lot of different forces at play here. Part of the understanding requires becoming familiar with the kind of gear works. When we take a look at how these different planets and bodies work together, we'll find different conduits and sort of gateways opening. And sometimes, you'll have a gateway that's stationary, and then another body will come in and it will modulate or temper that, increase or decrease its potency. So the cool thing with the moon is when it changes position and you begin to learn how to graph, we'll see changes in things like neuropeptide activity. Some of the neurotransmitter mixes will change. Serotonin, dopamine, epinephrine levels will change. And so I want you to get a hold of that book, and it's a good idea to read through the whole thing. Now, the other one I want you to get, this is also not an easy one to find, and the reason that I want you to get this is because it does a really good study on people experiencing paranormal activity through different cultures over time and identifying similar characteristics. And it's called The Undiscovered Country, and it's by Stephen Jenkins. Now, as I look at the camera, it looks like it's backwards, so this is The Undiscovered Country and its adventures into other dimensions, and the last name is spelled Jenkins. But one of the really cool things about this book is it lists particular dates that occur throughout a year where certain kinds of events are likely to occur. And so that's a must-have, must-read. I also want to encourage you to get a hold of two other books. These are fiction books by C.S. Lewis. One is called Perelandra. It's Perelandra. And the other one is Out of the Silent Planet. Now there's another book called That Hideous Strength. These are very interesting novels, and I don't want to give too much away, but in the novels there's a description of a kind of hierarchy of paranormal entities. And in my experience and research, I found that somehow, I don't know how he did it, but Lewis actually seems to have identified what I think is, in many ways, a very accurate description of how paranormal entities are arranged in a hierarchical structure. Now, these are enough tools for you to start to get a much better handle on tracking down when, where, and why paranormal activity will begin to manifest. And you will also start to get a much better handle on certain activities of your shadow self. But there's something else that we need to talk about. This is not well known in the public. Sadly, traditional astrologers, psychologists, even psychologists that are versed in a lot of Carl Jung's work are not familiar with this material. But there are two bodies in the cosmos that are intrinsically linked with the dark shadow self. And these two bodies, when you know what to look for and you know how to analyze them, they give a perfect, as far as can be perfect in this study, description of the actual character of your personal shadow self. There's a way that you can find out what its personality is like, how it acts, in a sense, what does it look like? What does it feel like? What are its motives? Possibly what are its areas of weaknesses? And this isn't like information that, I said before, some of the information that we're talking about is fairly sensitive, super sensitive, and I wanted to only offer certain kinds of nuggets of information, through a sort of a special class. This isn't like, hardcore into the super sensitive stuff, but it's still sensitive material. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to provide a training specifically on how you can find out what your personal shadow self is, what it's like, and also how to defeat it, find out what its weaknesses are. And in that training, we'll also take a look at where does it live? What part of your life is it hidden in? And then we'll also take a look at how can we track it? How can we know specifically what times it's active and how will it tend to manifest? This information is still somewhat sensitive. It should only be used for greater good. It should never be used to try to gain an unfair advantage over anyone. Understand that if the information is misused for temporary personal gain, this area is an exploration into something that's quite evil and dark. So you will not have the latitude to use this in a selfish way without a payback, and that payback will be far in excess of any short-term gain that you might think that you derive. An understanding of what your true shadow self is and how to manage it properly will dramatically change not only many aspects of your life, but it will give you an immense degree of security over hostile paranormal influences that want to try to mess with you. And if you're in a situation where you've had to deal with long time personal afflictions, if you've been honestly feeling like a negative hostile paranormal influence has been messing with you, this is a significant key, a really important key at turning the tide. When you get a handle on this, when you have an understanding of this and you manage it properly, and you can find out when is it active, when is it dormant, you'll provide an enormous amount of liberty. So you'll have greater safety, when you're doing paranormal investigations, and you'll have a much better grasp. When we can neutralize these specific two negative influences, we're exponentially closer to self-actualization. So those things in your life that really matter, when you want to really start to experience fulfillment, to the degree that you understand and master this, you'll see just tremendous growth there. So this is the part of the training where there will be a fee required, and I'm going to put a link below. If you're serious about wanting to study this, you can enroll in this as a course. What I'm going to do is I'm going to wait till we have a minimum of 10 students that want to pursue that material. Then I'll get busy and put it together, and I will release the link to a private video, and you can view it. And I'm going to keep the fee down on this. So the fee, it'll be probably like an hour, video, and the fee will be something like, I don't know, $70 US. And what I'll do is I'll step you through, it'll be literally a step-by-step explaining what this is, how it works, how you track it, how you find out, and you'll have access to special links and folders on my website, which will be resources, so that as you track this information down, you'll get full descriptions that you can review. So you'll end up basically with pages of information that explicitly describe what that dark part of your personal psyche is, and you'll have tremendous clues on how to manage it. Now, in some cases, some of you, I think all of this content in the training will be well within the reach of any students. You don't have to have a background in things like astrology or science to be able to understand the material and apply it. But if there are people out there, maybe they have time constraints, or they want to have an extra hand, I'll consider, if a person just wants to have this material generated for them, and it's really important to you, then I may look at doing that for you, with a fee. But my hourly rate is quite expensive. I usually charge $250 US per hour to do consultations. I know that there's people viewing this that don't have that kind of cash, so talk to me. Maybe I can scale it down. If you're in school, you want to have this generated, maybe I can lower it down to about half that price. But just, tell me what your situation is, what your life circumstances are, and depending on what my time and availability is like, I'll do the best that I can to meet you halfway. But for most of you, I would encourage you, while, I can make the effort to generate this content for you, I think it would serve you well, to take the training. It's $70, and you'll know how to do it then. And not only will you know how to do it for yourself, but you'll know how to do it for other people. Because, if you're doing paranormal investigation and you have a team, that team, isn't just one person, it's all of you. And all of you will have different shadow selves. So, if you know how to do it for yourself, then you'll know how to do it for the rest of your team. So that means if you find yourself embarked on a serious adventure and you want to increase your probability of safety, then knowing how to determine the specifics of the shadow selves for your entire team is going to come in really handy. And on top of that, the training will also allow you to track evil real time, not just for yourself or your team, but what's actually happening in the sky. And that training will provide that for you. So in the below you'll find a link. You can fill out an enrollment form. You should submit your payment for the training course, and then the training course will be released. It may be an enrollment. I think what we're going to do is, I've seen this kind of thing play out different ways, different times for people. We could hold the special training as soon as a week from this upload. Might be a couple of weeks, might be a month, maybe 2 months. It's really going to depend on how quickly the seats fill up. So when we have a minimum of 10 people enrolled, I'll make sure that the content gets generated shortly after we reach that ceiling. There may be a situation where some people may want to sponsor other people. You know, what needs to happen is we need, like I say, a minimum of 10 people. You can find in the link of this video below to the enrollment form, and that enrollment form will have like a PayPal link so you can purchase your registration. And if there's people out there that really want to take the course, but they can't afford the small fee for the training, in that case, there may be people that might be willing to sponsor you. And so, you know, sometimes the way that can work is if you really want to take the training but you can't afford it, maybe leave a comment in the section below of the video and maybe just state your case. You know, describe why you want to take the training. Can anyone sponsor you? Because some of the viewers, I'm guessing that are watching this video, may really want to take the training quickly, and maybe to expedite delivery, they might be willing to sponsor, you know, one or two other people. So, like I say, as soon as we've got 10 seats filled and registered, I'll have the content up shortly after that. And in the comment section of this video below, you'll also find a link full of references and citations, more information, you know, some of the contents like the images and text that you've seen flash by on the screen in this course. You'll be able to access more details in depth on the web via that link. So I hope this was of interest. I hope you enjoyed it, and I look forward to hearing back from you. And we'll move forward onto additional content soon. Take care, everyone.
Yes, sir. Yes. I'd like to explain everything. We didn't mean to steal the map. We didn't mean to run away.
What do you mean you didn't mean to steal the map?
It just sort
Well, of course you didn't mean to steal it. I gave it to you, you silly man. And that... Do you really think I didn't know?
Sir?
I had to have some way of testing my handiwork. I think it turned out rather well, don't you?
Hmm?
Evil turned out rather well. Mm-hmm. Whose are these?
Mine, sir. They're mine, sir.
You really are an untidy boy. Sign here.
Do you mean you knew what was happening to us all the time?
Well, of course, I am the supreme being. I'm not entirely dim.
Oh, no, sir. We weren't suggesting that, sir. It's just that...
Yet I let you borrow my map. Now, I want every bit of evil placed in here. Right away.
Of course.
Come on.
You mean you let all those people die? Just to test your creation?
Yes. You really are a clever boy.
Why did they have to die?
You might as well say, why do we have to have evil?
Oh, we wouldn't dream of asking a question like that, sir.
Yes. Why do we have to have evil?
Ah. I think it's something to do with free will. Be careful. Don't lose any of that stuff. That's concentrated evil. One drop of that could turn you all into hermit crabs.